One of the reasons we fail at our life, or we fail to live the life that's worth living, that purposeful life, that intentional life, is that our conduct doesn't matter or doesn't match our beliefs. You see, information without transformation is a waste of our time. Hi, I'm Pastor Bill with your Maple Minute for Tuesday, August the 18th, 2020. A.W. Tozer made this statement that is so good. He said, the low view of God entertained almost universally among Christians is the cause of 100 lesser evils everywhere among us. He wasn't wrong either. You see, when we view God improperly, we have a tendency to slide away from God, to think more of ourselves than we should, and to get ourselves into trouble. That's just the bottom line. And that leads to that life that we really don't want to live. Because what we've been discussing over the last several Maple Minutes is that intentional life, that life that's purposeful, that leads to a blessed life. But the problem is the threshold for sin is lowered or raised in proportion to our view of God, who He is. And my rationalizing sin proves that my view of God is way too low. You see, when we lower our view of God, we lose our sense of being accountable to Him. And we sort of make our own rules, make our own minds up, and that can be a problem, can't it? We sin more easily when we think less of God. And this habit of excusing sin is often set into motion by comparison. And as we said before, there is no win in comparison. You see, if we analyze our lives according to how other Christians live, we begin to justify our behavior based on what's going on in the larger Christian community. And then we're capable of doing wrong things. That's why you see some of these major Christian leaders, pastors of mega churches, getting involved in gross sins because they have gotten into the comparison trap and they forgot who they serve. As the state of the general Christian community trends downward and becomes so soft on sin, so do our lives. We are a people adrift who desperately need to reclaim that part of our belief system that states that we should fear God. You see, Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 23 helps us out understand the issue because the author of Proverbs wrote, the fear of the Lord leads to life. Then one rests content, untouched by trouble. Solomon, in all of his wisdom, he understood that life really had to be centered on fearing God, respecting God. To fear God means to be in awe of Him, to revere Him, which leads us to our second principle that we were trying to get across as we've been in this series about leading an intentional life. The first one was seek God, not sin. The second one is fear God, not men. Fear God. Yes, God is our friend, but He's not my homeboy like some people try to say. He's not one of those guys that just buddy around. See, we are certainly not God's equal in any way, shape, or form because God is the ultimate creator. He's the ruler of the universe, and we are just creations. And that's something that we don't like to talk about because it makes us not as cool as we think we are. God is above us in every way, shape, and form. His thoughts are so much higher, but we have a tendency not to think of Him in that way because we don't like to think of ourselves as less. We like to emphasize how important we are. A poet, Wilbur Rees, he wrote this poem that's entitled, I'd Like to Buy $3 Worth of God, Please. And I think it's so appropriate as far as the context of what we're talking about. In this poem, as I'm going to read you a few lines of it, what he simply states is the view most people have of God, especially in Christianity. He says it like this, and listen carefully. I'd like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Not enough to explode my soul or disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of God to make me love a black man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of the womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. I think that's how we all are. We often go to church and punch the clock to get our 1 hour's worth of sermon in so we can feel better about who we are and say that we're devoted followers of Christ. But the truth of the matter is we really haven't devoted much to God. It's something we do as an addendum, not as a main emphasis or week. In fact, so much of us, we take off on the weekends because that's our days. And if we don't have anything better to do, we might show up to church, we might show up to God. We certainly don't devote a lot of time to thinking about him during the day until problems arrive. And that just shows you our low view of God. You see, once again, we sin more easily when we take less thinking about God and who he is. You know, we often blame the culture for our issues, and we often blame a godless society for a lack of morality. But the truth of the matter is, according to what we've said so far, it really is the Christian's view of God that's caused all this. You see, we cannot expect the blind man to see. But those of us who have had our eyes open, we should be able to see God for who he is. And that's the truth. You know, in looking through the Bible, especially in this subject here of fearing God, what we can come across is, I boil it down to four ways that fearing God is generally displayed in our lives. And that's what we want to talk about in the closing moments of this Maple Minute. Number one, we would have to say this. It's a reverential awe of God's nature. A reverential awe of God's nature is how we display the fear of God. That means when I think about, and this is the problem, so often we don't have a good idea of who God is, what his character is, who God's nature really is. And so we aren't in awe of who he is. We don't think that God actually will do the things that he could do. And that's why, if you ever look through the Bible, as we talked about on Sunday, a guy like Abraham, he can simply trust God that God would raise his son back from the dead because he knew God's nature, his character. He knew that God was a loving God. And as Christians, so often we don't know that. That's why the why questions come out in our life, because we really haven't had that reverential awe of God's nature. Find out who God is. Number two, it's an awareness of God's presence. You know, it's amazing. Growing up as a kid, whenever my parents were around, I behaved a lot better than when they weren't around. And before you judged a preacher, you probably were the same way. You know, the evil eye, if you ever had that from your dad or your mom, kept you in line, didn't it? Because we were aware of their presence. One of the reasons why things are so sinful in our culture today is a lack of the awareness of God's presence, even in the Christian community. You see, we would do a lot less if God was with us in our minds. He is there with us, but we don't put him there. You see, this awareness of God's presence helps us understand how we should fear God. Number three, I would say this. We should have a holy dread of displeasing God. That's one of the things that also kept me in line with my parents. You see, it wasn't just the fact that I was scared of the punishment of my parents, but there came a point in my life when I realized I did not want to disappoint. I did not want to fail my parents. It's the same thing that happened when I played ball too. I wasn't always the best ball player, but I hated failing my teammates and especially my coach. I would try to do anything I could in my limited abilities to make it work. And that's where fearing God comes in. Because when we fear God, we have a holy dread of displeasing the God of the universe. That's one of those things, man, we get so upset sometimes about letting down our families, letting down our bosses, but we don't always have that awareness of God that is displayed in a holy dread of displeasing him. We watch things that we shouldn't watch. We listen to things we shouldn't listen to. We do things we shouldn't do because we're not afraid to displease God because we don't fear God. And then number four, fearing God is displayed by a growing hatred of evil. That should be, and that usually is the easiest one because we all know that's what we're supposed to do. But notice the order. That's the fourth one. The other three are first. It's amazing when you read through the Bible accounts that men, some of the greatest men, they saw some of the most they saw some of the biggest inconsistencies in the culture they lived in, and they took a stand because of that growing hatred of evil. You know, I think we're easy to get involved in social matters today. We want to picket everything and protest everything, and certainly there are some evil things going on. But are we doing it because we fear God, or are we doing it just to make a social statement? I think today, too many Christians, we're trying to be against things and for things that we forget that we should be fearing God, and that fear of God should grow into a hatred of evil. God hates evil. So should we. And we should learn from God how to hate evil. Because when we learn to hate evil, sometimes we get angry at people. God didn't get angry at people. God loved people. As we move forward in this, we want to remind ourselves, fear God, not men. We have a really high thinking pattern about what or who we should revere in life. Respect from our boss, our peers, our fellow friends. But I would encourage you this week, take a look at who you really fear. Who do you really respect? Are you fearing God? Remember, too, that conviction, if you're feeling convicted today, it's worthless till it converts into conduct. That's the truth, remember? And if we just learn things, all we've done is educate. Education is worthless without transformation. Knowledge without any change doesn't help. So what are you changing in your life based upon this? If you feel like you have a propensity to sin easily in your life, maybe it's because you don't have the right view of who God is. Maybe you should open up your Bible and start taking some time to view who God is in your life. You may have made yourself the most important person in your life, and that wouldn't be what God wants. Let's make sure that we're putting God in first place.